Welcome and thank you for tuning in to the second part of the course Unincorporated Histories, Puerto Rican Art Then and Now. And this course is being offered to coincide with the exhibition No Existe, Mundo, Poshuracán, Puerto Rican Art in the Wake of Hurricane Maria, on view now at the Whitney Museum. My name is Angela Brown. I'm a Joan Titch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum. We're PhD candidates in art history programs. We develop educational programs, tours, things like that. It is my pleasure to be presenting this course to you all with a show that has been really close to my heart and has also offered me the opportunity to place some of the work in the exhibition, all made in the past 5 years. All the work included in No Existe is made in the last 5 years since Hurricane Maria in 2017. And to situate that work into a wider arc of Puerto Rican art history. And that's what we did last week, and we'll be continuing that today. So last week, we considered the function of the aerial view in Puerto Rican art and in depictions of Puerto Rico more generally. We discussed the ways in which US developers and even earlier Spanish landowners present Puerto Rico as something to be cut up and consumed, and how, in the face of this greed, Puerto Rican artists have asserted the inseparability of the land from the people. One of the common themes across the works included in No Existe is the insistence on remembering, not just loss in the abstract, but in its specifics. The poster on the screen now is by Garvin Sierra Vega, and it features the sort of central number to this exhibition, 4,645. And that is the official death count of people who were lost during Hurricane Maria. Often we see this number depicted as well with a plus sign after that final 5 there. And that alludes to the fact that, you know, when losses are suffered, there's always a sort of domino effect, right? That one disaster does not end as soon as the natural disaster itself, such as the hurricane, is over. That you know, there are years of rebuilding and consequences, and thus the plus sign that we often see. So, you know, this number is actually made more potent when we juxtapose it with the very gross undercount that was provided by then Governor Ricardo Rosselló in 2017 after Hurricane Maria. And that governor announced that the death count was only about 60 people. And so this gives you a sense of the diminishing on the part of the government of the losses suffered, both in terms of lives lost and infrastructure, and both physically and psychologically. So in this talk, I'll focus on works that use specificity in many forms to demand acknowledgement and change. My title, Protest in Print, Memory and Matter, provides a loose structure for the works that I'll present. And those works include printed works, from posters to poetry, which are used as tools for protest in various forms, as well as art and performances that use the natural and urban environment as sites on which to inscribe memory and archive a material and human presence. And I'll explain that more as I go with each work. Some people in the galleries recently and during my other talks about No Existe have asked me what art can possibly do to oppose the oppression of Puerto Ricans, to oppose colonialism more generally. And I want to emphasize the fact that colonialism, because it alters education, because it affects language, because it suppresses languages, archives people's voices, because it separates families and takes land, colonialism attacks memory, right? And so memory is something that the artists in this presentation relentlessly represent and protect. The final section of the exhibition is subtitled Resistance and Protest. And this selection of posters, also by Garvin Sierra Vega, is included in that part of the exhibition. Many of these posters emerged on Sierra Vega's Instagram account, Taller Gráfico PR, in the summer of 2019. And that summer, as some of you will recall, or many of you, I hope, a series of text messages were leaked between the then governor, Ricardo Rosselló, who gave that grossly low undercount, and his cronies, other politicians, people in his circle. And these text messages revealed not only simple government corruption, but a real disrespect towards such a wide range of Puerto Ricans. So he spoke they spoke very disrespectfully about women, about queer people. They joked about those who were suffering still from the damages of the hurricanes, who were still grieving. Jokes about forgetting to distribute certain resources. And seeing this disrespect, this being flippant with regards to such a real trauma was really the last straw for Puerto Ricans. And so they gathered in the Capitol, and over 15 days, they protested in the street and demanded that Governor Rosselló resign. Those protests were ultimately successful. And what you're seeing here is this range of posters, right? And a lot of the coloring and the sort of techniques or design techniques that Sierra Vega is using here come from a really fruitful era of graphic design and poster making in Puerto Rico in the 1950s and 60s. And so, these colors are reminiscent of a time right after Puerto Rico became a so-called Estado Libre Asociado of the United States, which is a free associated state, a sort of confusing and purposefully ambiguous term that for a little while, some people thought represented a sort of change in how much Puerto Ricans had to say, or how much they were able to be sovereign, basically, to make decisions for themselves, to vote on things. And of course, there were changes from the previous status, which was as Puerto Rico simply as a US military territory. But as the years go on, we see that there are these broken promises with regards to this label, right? And the rights that are afforded to Puerto Ricans under this label. And so I give you that sort of jump into the 50s just because Sierra Vega is recalling, this moment of trying to create a cultural narrative to figure out, what sorts of imagery brings Puerto Ricans together in these moments of change, moments of crisis, as well as moments of hope. And I think you can see my cursor here. I'll just point out a couple of the different causes that really came together in those days of protest with people gathered in the streets. We have, like I said before, the death count with a plus sign here, a phrase that became really central to the protest, solo el pueblo salva al pueblo, only the people save the people. We have here a poster that says la misma mierda, the same shit, and it has a blue pile and a red pile, the Democratic and Republican parties, or in Puerto Rico, the two main political parties are the pro-statehood and the pro-status quo parties, that is keeping Puerto Rico's status with regards to the United States the way that it is now. Ni una más, there was a real rise in femicides after Hurricane Maria, and so addressing issues of misogyny. And so there's a range here. Over here, a middle finger that says fuck Luma. Luma is a electric company that was put in place by a US elected economic board that, it was promised that this new company would fix the electric grid. Yet there have been more rolling blackouts, more disasters, sort of explosions at power centers and than ever before in recent history, while prices are going up. And so I give you all of those causes, all of these issues that came together during these protests to underscore the idea that imagery, right? Imagery gets attached to a cause and then is more easily able to spread around and to pick up steam. As social media became an expanded public square, a place for open discourse that linked protests in San Juan with anti-apartheid activism in Palestine, Black Lives Matter protests across the United States, and a wide range of causes. More locally, the real public square, the city itself, Old San Juan, became an archive or even a canvas, where protesters made their voices visible on the walls of Old San Juan, with city officials hardly being able to keep up with painting over graffiti and taking down signs and banners. Here we see a work by Yu Tirado, and this work is not included in the exhibition, but last week we discussed Tirado's sandcastles representing major hotels and resorts in Puerto Rico. And so here Tirado is continuing his exploration of these images of Puerto Rico that are made for the tourist, and he's combining that with this kind of record of how the city became this canvas for protest. And so with these souvenirs, they're made out of these small little houses that represent the colonial style architecture in Old San Juan and in many of the old Spanish cities of former Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Latin America. And Tirado realized that a lot of these sort of tchotchkes in the gift shops had stickers on the back that said that they were made somewhere else. They weren't even made in Puerto Rico. And so they're this kind of global symbol or globalizing symbol that, you know, is brought back as a reminder for tourists that they went to this beautiful place. Yet it's this sort of farce, right? Because it was made somewhere else for this wider tourist market. And then he intervenes in these bought souvenirs by adding, you know, imagery that was all over the place during those protests in 2019. I'd like to suggest a precedent for Tirado's work in the American painter Martin Wong's paintings of New York City's Lower East Side in the 1980s. A lot of Wong's paintings picture these downtown cityscapes, densely packed with buildings, diverse, with chain link fences, and in this case, a handball court covered in graffiti. And within the visual noise, within this sort of cacophony of languages that merge in a place like New York City, right? Wong inserts or often inserts hands spelling out phrases in American Sign Language, and you see that at the bottom of the painting here. At the top of the painting, floating in the sky there in black text, is a poem by Miguel Piñero. And Piñero was Wong's collaborator and romantic partner, and he was the founder of the Nuyorican Poets Café. And that poem reads, "I knocked out lightning, drowned a drop of water, put handcuffs on the wind, locked thunder in jail, slapped Jesus in the face, and ran Satan out of hell." And then in American Sign Language down at the bottom, Wong responds and says, "It's the real deal, Neil. I'm going to rock your world, make your planets twirl, ain't no whack attack." So these are these kinds of cryptic signs and phrases of self-affirmation, right? Hyping oneself up, sort of trying to one-up the person that you're talking to, often in, and sometimes in a sort of playful way. And the art historian Yasmin Ramirez has pointed out that this style called toasting is a huge predecessor for 1990s rap in New York. And so, you know, this idea of going back and forth and self-affirming, right, and is really important here. And then the graffiti itself that Wong is picturing is another form of this self-affirmation, right? Somebody's tag represents their identity in some way. It becomes recognizable to other people. And then these tags become layered one on top of the other, so that we get this palimpsest, this layered account of the presence of people, right? Just passing through this handball court, but really asserting their sense of place there. And a sense of place within Puerto Rico and in diaspora is sort of a running theme in this talk as well. A picture of Piñero there on the right. So I'd like to argue that specificity brings people together, right? So having a specific story, getting the details, you know, right, really considering people's stories, that makes for a more potent archive, right? It makes sure that you're taking a range of people's experiences into consideration. This is another poster by Sierra Vega, and I'm showing you here how that poster appears on his Instagram page. And so this spells out in American Sign Language, Ricky renuncia. And on that subject of the public square, right, rather than the handball court, we have the Instagram page in which people comment, applauding with emojis, asking if Sierra Vega will make some of these designs into t-shirts, right, wanting to sort of expand the network of a common cause. And then even people, suggesting small changes, right? The C in Ricky, that third hand on the top row, two commenters are suggesting it be turned, right? So there's this feedback that's happening on Instagram, which becomes this public sphere that's not only accessible in the space of San Juan during those protests, but much wider. As we discussed last week with regards to the Ponce massacre, to be visible sometimes is to be at risk. And I went into the details of this painting by Daniel de Jesus last week, but I bring it up again just to nod at one of the works in the show that, like this connection I'm drawing between Martin Wong's painting and Sierra Vega's posters, draw this connection between New York and Puerto Rico, right? Show this solidarity and this arc of shared coalition building, right? Where protests in Union Square here, which the Jesus is showing a moment of in blue and red with a police officer and de Jesus's friend, layered over. So that was a Union Square protest in solidarity with the 2019 protests in Puerto Rico, layered over this archival image of the Ponce massacre. Since sometimes being seen or being legible is unsafe, some language or ideas gain power by remaining opaque or mysterious to the oppressor, or even simply remaining mysterious to the outsider. The title of the exhibition, No existe mundo, poshuracán, comes from a footnote in this book of poetry by Raquel Salas Rivera. And Salas Rivera has written on how he's used translation and how he's come to think about translation in his work, as he often sort of combines Spanish and English, either translating things directly or leaving things untranslated. And with regards to untranslation, he says, "Generally, my poetry concerns itself with loss. I leave many words in Spanish intact when I feel the translation will silence rather than open up new meaning." And he gives an example. "Even though adoquines are cobblestones, my adoquines, the ones I stumbled over on my way to and from the water, could never bear the word cobblestone. Sometimes the word in Spanish is so enmeshed with the poem's life that changing it would be too painful." And so I bring this up in this role of poetry here to again suggest this connection with the Nuyorican Poets Café, with Miguel Piñero, where sometimes the meaning of something doesn't need to be accessible to everyone, and in fact sometimes it is made in order to appeal or to speak to a specific group, right? And that can be strategic. And that then translation can come after that, and can be strategic in its own right. And so this adds to my argument then around specificity, and on the local, right? Having a specific group that understands the meaning of specific things, like Salas Rivera's adoquines, means that there's a stronger bond between those people, that you have to do less translation and therefore can get to a solution or can get to a resolution perhaps more quickly than you would if you were doing more translation. And on this subject of the local, Edra Soto here in this work, Graft, included in the exhibition, makes sure that we know that to look at images of others' disaster is inherently to intrude, to invade someone's privacy. So in this work, Soto has embedded images, photographs that she took in the days after Hurricane Maria, in Puerto Rico. She's embedded them in this wall, this installation of quebrasoles or rejas. And this means that you think of this architectural form, a form of vernacular architecture, being on the outside of someone's house, usually sort of on the edge of their lawn or their property. And so peering in to this wall actually enacts a peeping into someone's private space. And so instead of adding to that pile of images of disaster, these high resolution images of flooding and roofs torn from houses, which often makes the people behind those images anonymous, Soto really implicates you in the fact that you're peering into people's real lives. So now I'll transition from making words or images visible to the public to putting the body itself in the street, or making the body visible in performance more specifically. Here is a work from 1977 by the artist Papo Colo, and it's titled Superman 51. This is a video still of a live performance that took place on the West Side Highway, which of course runs right next to where the Whitney Museum is now. Colo attached all these pieces of wood, tied them to his body, and there are 51. So one extra state than the United States 50 states. And the meaning behind this number is sort of ambiguous here, because it makes you think of this idea of Puerto Rico becoming a 51st state. But then when you consider that in the context of what Colo does with these blocks of wood, it raises questions around, what his thoughts are on that, and on this sort of expansion of US empire. And so what he did was, with these pieces of wood tied to him, he ran at full speed down the highway, and ran until basically he collapsed. And so I'll give you an image here. Before I get to this, actually, the scholar Sandra Ruiz has analyzed this performance of Colo's and said that he reclaims time. So Colo's existing in colonial time, a Puerto Rican living in New York, and he's reclaiming that time through endurance, but also through a sort of staged failure. This idea of staged failure is dealt with in a way by Nivia Pastrana Santiago in her 2019 work, Indisposed Objects, Suspended Inaugurations, or Inevitable Endings for an Almost Dance. Parts of that performance took place in the Whitney Museum, but beforehand there were these sorts of movement research aspects titled Port Practice that Pastrana Santiago performed on the west side near the Whitney Museum. So sort of in that same zone that Colo is running down the highway, which was then, right next to piers and the factories. And now we see it as, has this landscaping and bike paths. And so the contrast there is quite interesting with the changes in New York. And in this image from Port Practice, I'm showing you a moment of brief effort where Pastrana Santiago is attempting to push this white barricade. But otherwise, she performs what she has described as, quote, useless acts, like caressing the edges of construction sites. Useless, but pedestrians are forced to look at them, forced to become curious, to acknowledge Pastrana Santiago's presence. Pastrana Santiago has talked about how each physical decision here, and in many of her performances, is filled with tension, right, charged, because she knows that it will be anchored as an image. And this is something that that dancers wrestle with in many ways, right? That dance, because it is ephemeral, can only be captured in film and an image. And so then does it change the way then that you move your body when you know that your body will become an image? And so, not only can it become an image, but it can become even a memory for one of these people walking by. So that one moment survives, or one moment is documented or made permanent, but the rest disappears. And in fact, disappearance becomes sort of strategic sometimes, sort of like that mysteriousness or opacity that Salas de Rivera was talking about with regards to translation. For Pastrana Santiago, this work, because it was part of the 2019 biennial, she was forced to consider in relation to the protests going on with regards to then trustee of the Whitney Museum, Warren Kanders, whose company Safariland, it was shown, was producing tear gas that in fact during those 2019 protests was used against protesters in Puerto Rico. And so the money that was behind the institution that Pastrana Santiago is invited to work in, right, then has this direct sort of chemical relationship to the protests in Puerto Rico. However, while some artists pulled their work from the biennial in protest to this revelation, Pastrana Santiago had already performed, right? The dance had already disappeared. And so you can't pull something, right, that's already been done. And so this raises interesting questions about, how dancing becomes part of, or how movement in general fits into our ideas of archiving and of presence or even protest. So while Papa Colo's Superman 51 is a failed physical effort, in port practice, Pastrana Santiago's collapse or rest is instead a refusal of effort, or at least a refusal of the expectations of effort or completion. In a way, Pastrana Santiago retools some of the broken promises, or the idea of the broken promise, which is evoked in Gabriela Torres-Ferrer's work here, which uses a found object from the debris of Hurricane Maria to highlight the empty promises of a range of things in Puerto Rico. One, voting in plebiscitos. Plebiscitos are these periodic referenda where Puerto Ricans are invited to vote on such issues as this sign says, statehood. However, those votes are non-binding. In other words, even if everyone voted a certain way, it would ultimately be up to US Congress to decide. So it's said that in cases like this, Puerto Ricans have voz pero no vota, voice but no vote. And so it's, these empty democratic promises or processes, which then, coincide with empty promises. The empty promise of the United States so-called fixing the Puerto Rican economy with the installation of an economic control board in 2015, which is still in place, and fixing the electric grid, like I was referencing before with Sierra Vega's poster with regards to the company Luma. The rest of the works that I'll discuss deal with making as a form of tracing the body's presence, announcing or even proving he was here, they were here, she was here. And this is a basic human instinct, right? Some of the earliest human works of art that we know of, cave drawings and things, right, just show that someone was there, a handprint. And this marking of existence is fundamental. And in this work here by Gabriela Baez, we have Baez wrestling with the idea of finding a tactile connection to a person that one can no longer be physically close to. And so about a year after Hurricane Maria, Baez's father, who we see here, with the artist as a child on the upper left on the beach, Baez's father took his own life. And this unfathomable, right, event, a tragedy that one can't make sense of, right, that one can put over and over in one's head and continue to question it, right? Something as fundamental as life and death is no easy thing to find a resolve with. And so Baez, who received all of their father's belongings, looked through family photos and intervened in some of these photos, as we see here, where they've drawn using red thread lines connecting their head to their father's, each of their fingers together like a sort of cat's cradle, using touch, right, marking as a way of establishing closeness, showing that proof, right, that these were two people on earth together at the same time. Bias also, who has some background in anthropology, their instinct was to photograph a lot of their father's objects from above, turning those objects into these kinds of archaeological artifacts even, right? So when we think of ancient cultures and the things that are left behind, those things are used to figure out what life was like for these people, right? And so bias is doing the same thing at a much closer range, things that seem more present, though VHS tapes, maybe not so much, but the VHS tape, the Pink Floyd t-shirt, all of these become proof, evidence of Bias's father having been here. Right? I was here, he was here. Sofia Gallisa Moriente, in her film Celaje here, Cloudscape, embraces the formal elements of destruction. So after 2017, she was using film that was moldy from humidity, corroded with salt, instead of pushing against this aspect of living in the Caribbean, right? She decided to embrace it, to allow her work to formally take on what was also going around in the landscape, right? The destruction of the hurricane could then be mirrored by the destruction of the film. So like Edra Soto, Gallisa Moriente was uncomfortable adding to that pile of high resolution images of a damaged Puerto Rico. So instead, she chooses to tell the story of her grandmother's life, getting specific, alongside a slightly more general story of Puerto Rico from the mid-20th century to today. In Gallisa Moriente's grandmother's town where she lived in Levittown, Puerto Rico. And she moved there in the 1960s when Levittown, among other towns in Puerto Rico, was sort of being presented as this this site for the American dream of upward mobility, of increasing one's social or economic standing. It was a sort of suburban place and was presented as a place of hope where many generations could grow up and prosper. But then by 2019, Gallisa Moriente is seeing how that promise was another broken promise, right? Levittown did not have these generations of people who stay, who prosper. Instead, after Gallisa Moriente's abuela passed away, she was reflecting on the way that her grandmother's house was damaged, was flooded during the hurricane. The neighbors' houses were shuttered. Other places in the neighborhood were turned into businesses. And so that dream of family, of sort of family permanence or family support, instead turns into this sort of slapshot tableau of capital, right? Trying to basically overtaking people. And so in addition to memory contained in material like film and architecture and graffiti, I want to talk about muscle memory, using this work here, Mapa by Lulu Varona. And muscle memory comes into play here because Varona's medium is embroidery and cross-stitch. And so she's continuing a tradition that so often is connected with the domestic, with the feminine, that's considered decorative. And she's using that technique to log recent history, as well as a broader arc of history. And so again, if you can see my cursor, Varona shows us a scene from the 2019 protests. On one of the buildings here in San Juan, you have graffiti that says Ricky renuncia, people on their bikes, figures holding different flags, the black and white Puerto Rican flag, the trans pride flag. And then these symbols that are like these sorts of weather map icons of hurricanes. And then in this zoomed in portion, this detail I have here, we have a woman sitting at a Singer sewing machine. And so Varona here is referencing this longer history of textile workers in Puerto Rico in the mid-20th century, when the US was trying to push the Puerto Rican economy from an agricultural one to an industrial one. Many textile mills were built on the coasts, in the coastal cities. And so a lot of people sort of left the mountainous interior, left more rural places, and went into the cities, right? So this creates these generational disconnections from land, but then also creates this history of muscle memory, where generations of women learn how to move fabrics and touch threads in a certain way, and see by watching how to use something like a Singer sewing machine. And so Varona transforms something that's so often pushed to the margins of art history, that is, design or the ornamental, and she uses it to make an important historical document. And I would say that embroidery that features the decorative, floral patterns and things like that are also powerful historical documents. But Varona here gets specific and shows us these moments from the protests, and reflects on issues in recent Puerto Rican history. So the family heirloom, right? You see something that looks embroidered, it feels like something that's passed down through generations. The family heirloom becomes this sort of history lesson. Another textile tradition in Puerto Rico is lace making. And I'm showing you here an installation shot from the 1997 Whitney Biennial, featuring works by Antonio Martorell. And Martorell collaborated with lace makers in Puerto Rico to make these unlaced atlases. And here he's sort of playing with the idea of center versus periphery. We talked last week about that aerial view and the map being this kind of tool of the colonizer, and maps also often reflect the kind of ideas or values of the colonizer. They scale things in certain ways, right? And so Martorell is using this form, this lace making form, to sort of play with that idea of what makes a map, what kinds of materials have authority, right? The map as an authoritative document used to navigate, versus the lace as something considered decorative. And one of the main lace traditions in Puerto Rico comes actually from the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain. And this tradition is called Tenerife lace. And this is interesting too. I'm showing you a picture of a veil of soles, which are these, soles translates to suns, these circular motifs of lace attached together here to make a sort of veil. And the artist Jorge Gonzalez made this in collaboration with Jasmine Rivera. And this is a tradition that comes from the Canary Islands, but then that in Puerto Rico takes on its own form. And there's a specific form of soles de naranjito, little oranges, like an orange slice. That's specific to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico became sort of well known for this specific lace motif. And so I include this in connection with the Martorell, just to say that any kind of so-called craft tradition, right? Any kind of technical skill that moves across continents for various reasons raises questions about, what culture's origins are, right? So is this only authentic if it comes from the Canary Islands, or what kind of authenticity comes out of the adaptation on the part of lace makers in Puerto Rico? And as Gonzalez has seen, because he's collaborated with other lace makers elsewhere, there's this wider network of lace makers in Latin America who have also sort of adapted this theme, and the lace then comes to reflect these global movements. Continuing to learn these skills not only contributes to the formation of archives for the present moment, but it also serves to honor the many Puerto Rican women whose labor and stories so often disappear. This is a still on the left from the film Manos a la Obra, which is another film directed by Jack Delano. I showed you Desde las Nubes, that aerial view film made by the Division for Community Education last week. Manos a la Obra is a fascinating film because it shows you this sort of montage of Puerto Ricans working, and often it's the emphasis on the hands, hence the title. And so often we have these zoomed in views of meticulous work. In economic brochures that were distributed to US companies and entrepreneurs, and a lot of sort of language around Puerto Rican industrialization at mid-century, talked about Puerto Ricans as being very meticulous and having very steady hands. And so in a way, the laborer, in this case, the woman in a textile factory, right, becomes reduced to her hands, to how meticulous she can be with those hands. And another poster for that film here. And this one, Marcela Guerrero, the curator of No Existe, includes in the exhibition catalog, referencing the fact that Garvin Sierra Vega and his posters is drawn, like I said before, from these color schemes of posters from the 1950s. And so that question of the hand, right? The hand is something that makes the trace, this memory and matter that I'm evoking in the title of this talk. But then also, of course, the hand has attached to it a body. So there's this balance that we have to strike, right, between what kinds of marks we preserve, who's doing that preservation, right, from whose perspective are those hands being framed. Sometimes artistic gesture preserves an energy that language cannot. Abuela Sterling Dupree, for example, in her series called Blindfolded, what she says she's doing in this series is drawing the currents of sound. And so she blindfolds herself and she plays music, usually jazz improvisation, either by Maelo Ismael Rivera or by Miguel Zenon, who interprets some of Maelo's songs. And she listens to that music and she responds to it with her body, right? Blindfolded, making these gestures that live mark her responses to that music, so that her body sort of combines, the improvisation of her body combines with the improvisation of the sound. And one of those blindfolded works was included in the most recent Whitney Biennial. And this one that I'm showing you on screen now is from 2021 in San Juan, in Santurce, at the Gallery Hidrante. And in this one, Sterling Dupree is able to, get on the floor here, and we see her with Pepe Alvarez Colon, who was in residency at the gallery at that time. And so she's on the floor, she's on the wall, she's collaborating with another person. So that improvisation is even more expansive than the improvisation, at least spatially, than the improvisation that we got at the Whitney Biennial. Because the Whitney Biennial had panels that were standing. And so I bring up this series and show you this work from it because Sterling Dupree draws from a really wide range of influences. So I said that she responds to jazz, but she's also mentioned the influence of the choreographer Trisha Brown to her work. She was a student of Trisha Brown's at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and remembers an exercise where Brown had all the students lay down and point their finger, close their eyes and point their finger, and then sort of move their finger as if drawing an invisible line through space, and then allowing the body to start sort of following that line. And so you can imagine that extension of an imagined line to the finger as a sort of mark maker, to then extending it from just the hand to the whole body. Sterling Dupuy was also influenced by the abstract expressionist painter Franz Klein, who himself also listened to jazz while painting. And in this work here in the Whitney's collection, Mahoning, you see that Klein is making this this improvisational gesture, right? These confident, bold marks. But then he names the painting after a town near his hometown of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is an old coal mining town. And so this connection, at least for me, especially seeing that confident black mark, right, and then seeing the sort of charcoal colors and the black ink here of this blindfolded work with Sterling Dupuy and Alvarez Colon, it makes you think about these artistic materials and how the materials themselves sometimes contain a history of labor. In Klein's case, that coal mining that likely his his grandfathers, great-grandfathers worked in. And then in the case of this work here by Francesca Ardo, it's dust itself that carries a material memory. And so, these forms are quite similar, right? The coal, and then the image that you're seeing here, which is a nanoscopic, it's at nanoscopic scale image of dust particles from dust samples collected in San Juan by Gardo's mother. Gardo zooms in, right, to examine this smallest element of Puerto Rico. She was doing a residency at Cornell University in Ithaca at the time that Hurricane Maria hit. And so, that experience of seeing Puerto Rico disappear on a weather map, right, that sort of trauma and the idea of a space disappearing makes this work even more potent as you think about just the dust particles, the smallest element of a place, which Gardo makes a sort of portrait of here, and was reflecting on the fact that, especially during certain seasons, the dust in the atmosphere of Puerto Rico actually comes from the Sahara Desert. And so the minerals that make their way into the soils of the Caribbean, in fact, come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and so form this material connection, right? Without any artistic intervention at all, just breathing in that dust forms this connection to the African continent across the Caribbean. And so Gardo highlights that and then adds these colored pencil. Well, the whole thing is colored pencil, but then these pixels in the back that sort of recall those pixelated weather maps of increasingly intense hurricanes, as well as these patterns of fabric, as Gardo's mother collected the dust samples on pieces of fabric. So I'll conclude with this work by Javier Orfón, which is from a series titled Bien Te Veo, I See You Well. And in this series, Orfón sort of carves into or incises coupé leaves with various phrases or images. And on this one, we have a phrase that was said to Orfón by José René Ramón. And here we have René, who's attributed by Orfón here on the leaf itself. And René is the ranger at the Bosque Estatal de Oaxaca. And so this is a really biodiverse forest in Puerto Rico. And Orfón, was struck by this phrase, which translates to, I don't recognize dead plants. And so this idea of the dead plant, is really pervasive in a lot of Western or Eurocentric traditions around preserving plant specimens. And so, the dried plant, right, gets sent to, to collections across the world and is studied by scientists. And yet when Orfón asked René to identify a dried specimen, he said that he was unable to recognize dead plants. And this becomes quite profound because it makes us think about what happens when we take something from its original context. a plant alive and amidst other plants that it often grows with, right, is one thing. But then a dried specimen attached to a piece of paper and sent to a museum or other kind of collection, at least according to Renee here, becomes even a completely different plant altogether. It's unrecognizable. And so, here's a installation view of how the works from that series are installed in No Existe right now. And I'll conclude with this final image, which brings us back, I hope, looping us to the idea of memory and matter. I'm pairing one of the works also from Bien Te Veo on the right with this image of Taino petroglyphs in Jayuya in Puerto Rico. And so these petroglyphs here, mark this presence, right? Like I was saying before with graffiti, to say I was here, to incise, to make a mark, is one of the most powerful things you can do. And Orfon is really interested in topophilia, which is a strong sense of place or a love of the land. And so, unlike dried specimens or paintings in foreign museums, these petroglyphs mark presence in its original context, and it's an archive that's inseparable from the land. Leaving a mark matters, and our gestures now speak to the future, they carry the past, and they spread awareness of the specific stories that we must listen to in order to imagine liberatory futures. So I'll conclude there and open up for questions. The first part of this course, which was titled Views from Sky and Land, having to do again with it said the aerial view, is available online. That was recorded, and you could find that on the Whitney's YouTube page. And I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat. Thank you all so much. I hope you get the opportunity to see the show. And I will wrap up there. Thank you.